Ladies and gentlemen, well, I'd like to begin the fifth and final plenary session of the Shangri-La Dialogue. I'd like to make a few remarks just to introduce this session. I was actually just reminded by the Minister of Defense of Australia that Giuseppe Verdi described an overture as a piece of music totally unrelated to the following opera, the purpose of which was only to quell the audience. So I suppose that's what my remarks have so often served in this Shangri-La Dialogue. I speak for a couple of minutes and you needn't pay too much attention, but the fact that you begin to sit down, find and take your seats means that the people to whom you really want to listen have a chance properly to be heard. So the last 200 words I've just uttered have been exactly like Verdi's overtures, totally unrelated to the excellent pieces of music you're about to hear, but happily have now served their principal purpose of quelling the audience. We have three speakers this morning in our concluding plenary. It's a delight to bring to the Shangri-La Dialogue and have her here, Federica Mogherini, the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, also holds the title of Vice President of the European Commission. She comes to Singapore following an important EU-Japan meeting in Tokyo. There's already been questions at this dialogue about the engagement of the European Union in Asia and even the specific relationship of the European Union with ASEAN, so you have no higher authority to question on those issues than Federica Mogherini. Delighted to have Kevin Andrews here, Minister for Defence of Australia. Australia holds the joint record with Singapore and Japan for perfect ministerial attendance since 2002, every year at the Shangri-La Dialogue. Thank you, Kevin Andrews, for ensuring that record is secure. And of course, it's always a signal honour and privilege to welcome to the podium our host Minister for Defence, Dr. Ung Eng Hen. So those are the authors of the pieces of music you're about to hear, and could I please invite Federica Mogherini to address the 2015 Shangri-La Dialogue.
Thank you, John. Let me start with a sincere thank you. First of all, for the invitation, because it is not to be given for granted that the European Union, that for sure is not an Asian or a Pacific power, is considered relevant in this dialogue. Still, it is, and very much so. We share economic relations, investments and trade interests, and that is evident to everybody, especially here in Singapore. But we share much more than that. We share political partnerships, security cooperation, global challenges to which we need to give responses that will be effective only if they will be joint ones. From terrorism to climate change, from natural disasters to cyber attacks, the threats we face today have no borders. They are global by nature, by definition, and we need strong global partnerships to face them. That's why it is natural to be here, to invest in our friendship. That's why you find a lot of Europe here, if you look around the people in this room. And let me come here to my second big thank you, to my friends that here with me in these days have represented Europe. Because the European Union is not just institutions in Brussels. It's a family, a community, where we share values, interests, visions, a lot of history, often a difficult one. I know Ursula was speaking about that this morning. But most of all, we share a lot of common future. And when we say Europe, we say all of us, each different, but all together. So let me thank the Defence Minister of Germany, Ursula, of the UK, Michael, of Spain, Pedro, friends and colleagues representing other European Union member states like France, or the European Parliament, European business, think tanks, research institutes, and last but not least, the chairman of the EU Military Committee, General de Rousier, that is now an habitué of these dialogues. Because yes, the European Union has a military dimension as well. Our economic phase is the one that most Asians and also most Europeans are more familiar with, and that is natural and that is good also. There are more goods and services traveling between Europe and Asia than across the Atlantic. That is amazing to us as well. We are one of the major investors in this continent, both in qualitative and quantitative terms, and the biggest development donor in this part of the world. But our engagement with Asia goes well beyond trade, investment, and aid. It's political, it's strategical, and it needs to develop more also in the security field. 4 out of 10 of the EU's strategic partners are Asian countries: China, Japan, India, and the Republic of Korea. It is not by chance that I have personally traveled to the region twice in less than a month, and in the very beginning of my mandate. I was in Japan, as you mentioned, John, for our EU-Japan summit just before flying here. I was in Seoul and Beijing a few weeks ago, and we are preparing to host the EU-China summit in Brussels at the end of June, while a summit with South Korea is also planned. I'm here today. I will come back again in the region in August for the ASEAN Regional Forum in Kuala Lumpur, and I look forward to chairing the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in Luxembourg in November. So, yes, we are here, even if we are clearly not part of the region, because we are partners of this region. And we believe it is our reciprocal interest to invest even more in our friendship and in the work that we can jointly do for the security of our people. So please, please, don't look at us just as a big free trade area. Continue looking at us also in this way. But consider that the European Union is also a foreign policy community, a security and defense provider for our own people, within our borders and in the rest of the world, in our own region that we know at the moment is one of the most turbulent ones, and we are ready to take more responsibility to bring security and stability in our part of the world, together with our neighbors, and with our global partners, Asia included. As while the European Union continues to be deeply engaged in Asia, we want to be more and more engaged with Asia, to address together our common challenges and to take full advantage of our common opportunities. In today's world, no region is as dynamic as Asia. There would be really good reasons to be optimistic about Asia's future. Still, the world of economics is closely connected to the world of security, and security threats are multiplying by the day. The most striking feature of Asia today is this unique combination of optimism, dynamism, and fragility. We see signals of rivalries among powers re-emerging. Some maritime disputes far from being settled. I believe we cannot afford it. We, Europe and Asia, have a strong interest in global security. A very basic interest regards the freedom of navigation on the arteries of the global economy. It is basic but essential if you think of how integrated economic supply chains have become. We have a direct interest in the respect for international law. We believe regionalism and multilateralism are the framework for cooperative international relations. And cooperation calls for everyone to play by the same rules. Agreed rules make states secure, people free, and companies willing to invest. When some decide to play by their own rules, cooperation gives way to confrontation. And in today's world, that is bad news for everyone. The same applies to maritime disputes, too. We need to maintain a maritime order based on international law, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. We are not getting into the legitimacy of specific claims, but we are resolute as Europeans on how they should be resolved. That is, peacefully, without the use or threat of force. We support the ASEAN-China negotiations for a code of conduct, and we hope they can be concluded soon. The region and the world can only benefit from a cooperative order. Our own European experience tells us that regional integration is about prosperity, for sure, but it is also about security. And it brings added value to all. As Ursula just said this morning, in Europe, I quote her, we partly gave up national sovereignty, but we gained way more economic and political power. Now, each region has and will have its own way to integration. For sure, it is not about exporting models, but we can for sure be partners in integration, sharing experiences and supporting each other, in particular with ASEAN. As we are working towards an upgrade in our cooperation with ASEAN, we have just adopted a policy setting out our vision of a partnership with a strategic purpose. Not just vague ideas on increased cooperation. This time, we list a number of concrete commitments and priorities. First, the EU has unique means and expertise on what ASEAN calls connectivity, otherwise eliminating barriers among member countries. With no other organization in the world can ASEAN discuss connectivity at a continental scale, including issues at the single market, aviation, research, higher education, and others. Second, we are more than doubling our assistance to ASEAN, increasing it to 170 million euros, and add our bilateral assistance to ASEAN member states, and the figure gets close to 3 billion euros. We also expect to use bilateral free trade agreements as stepping stones toward a full region-to-region free trade agreement. 3, our cooperation on non-traditional security is a huge growth area. The EU-ASEAN high-level dialogue in Malaysia last month was an opportunity to exchange the lessons we learned on piracy, maritime surveillance, port security. We are announcing dialogue on disaster relief, combined with greater capacity building, and we are increasing our engagement in the ASEAN Regional Forum. Last year, the European Union organized the first ever ARF training on preventive diplomacy and mediation. Fourth, in this light, it is quite obvious that we are talking about substantive steps towards a strategic partnership, heeding the call from ASEAN from a greater EU involvement in the region. And here we are in the region. We are here because we believe we have to work more and more together. Prime Minister Lee, in his keynote speech on Friday, reminded us all that we share common challenges, starting from terrorism, prevention of radicalization, and violent extremism. This is a top priority in our European political agenda, and we can only benefit from working more on that together, because the threat we are facing has no borders, no state, no region. It's global. Defeating Daesh and other terrorist groups is not just about military power. It is necessary, but it won't be sufficient. We will need a stabilized and inclusive Iraq, a Syria that finally heads towards national reconciliation, and a fully successful transition in Afghanistan, just to start with. The only path towards stability in the long run is built on democracy and respect for human rights. These tasks call for a truly global alliance among civilizations. And we need to work in our own countries, as the boundaries between external and domestic threats have quickly disappeared. Europe and Asia can do so much together, learning from each other on confronting the terrorist recruitment practices, for example, on preventing radicalization, on supporting capacity building in partner countries. Complex threats call for articulated responses, mixing military and civilian tools, good reflexes to act fast, and foresight to prevent new crises. We know in the European Union that we need to use our tools better, that we need to deserve our Nobel Peace Prize, not only for our history, and still, let me say, our history has a particular value today, a value that the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War reminds us every single day. But we need to transform the lessons we learned in our past in willingness and capacity to play a role, a major role, for the future. And I take this as my personal main responsibility, that of using all the potential that the European Union has, all our tools, all our policies, all our strength, in a coordinated and coherent way. Not easy, but possible, and very much needed. A big part of my job as Vice President of the European Commission, thank you for mentioning it, is coordinating all commissioners whose portfolio can impact on our common foreign policy. And we are finding out that that means potentially all commissioners, as there is no field of work that nowadays is purely internal. It's a team that is capable of dealing with trade, development, humanitarian aid, but also energy, counterterrorism, climate, and migration. The same goes for the coordination of our 28 member states, a work we do not just with all European foreign ministers, but also with those of defense, development ministers, and more often the interior ones. Let me confess to you one thing I found out coming to Brussels, that our machine can sometimes be a little bit complicated, a little bit bureaucratic, yes. But we do have the tools to ensure the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And we are finally starting to make good use of them, including the military ones. Maybe not many people in this part of the world, and not even in Europe, this is also my job, are aware that the European Union has been deploying its personnel in crisis zones for more than 10 years. We are currently running 5 military and 11 civilian missions on 3 continents. 7,000 women and men are deployed under the EU flag, taking risks and working for peace. Some Asian partners are contributing to our common security and defense operations. And let me thank those that do it, and those that are willing to do it in the future. Take the Atalanta mission, the EU naval operation in the Horn of Africa, which helped to bring down piracy attacks from 163 in 2009 to only 2 last year. And it is not an issue in these 2 days of work today, but maybe it was a few years ago. As part of this campaign, we have undertaken security cooperation with China, with Japan, and the Republic of Korea. Expanding our cooperation, also in this field, carries a huge potential. The work we do together for our common security is not limited to the elements I mentioned, but I am afraid my time is limited. So I'll stop here. And I'll stop by saying that indeed, our security today is indivisible. Thinking of zero-sum games brings us completely out of reality. Our interdependence forces us to work together, to build partnerships, strong ones. When both parties are strong, the partnership is strong. To diffuse tensions and invest in cooperation. This is why we are here, not for an attempt to change geography and pretend we are part of the region, as we limit our ambitions to the reasonable ones, but because we know that we need each other in today's world. So count on us, count on Europe, as we count on you. We want to be engaged in Asia, we want to partner with Asia, and I know that together we can work for Asia, for Europe, and for a world more stable, prosperous, and peaceful. And I'm looking forward to do that together in the next 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you for informally announcing a new 5-year plan for Europe-Asia cooperation and for reminding us that the EU is a security and defense provider. I know there's quite a lot of discussion, of course, in Europe and within the EU about whether it's time to update the documentation on European foreign policy and strategy. And as that is being considered and potentially drafted, of course, it will be of interest to this region to see what place Asia has formally in Europe's foreign policy and defense strategy. One of the things that happens during the Shangri-La dialogue is that the 5 ministers who take part in the 5 power defense arrangements are able to meet, and it's a delight to have 2 of those 5 here, but to introduce now to give an important perspective from an important power in the Asia-Pacific, Kevin Andrews, Minister for Defense of Australia. The podium is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege to be here and to continue the perfect record, along with Singapore and Japan, of attendance at this important Shangri-La dialogue, and also for the opportunity to make a contribution on this session on building cooperation between regions. Ladies and gentlemen, interestingly, we are seeing less of a distinction between the regional and the global, making the topic that we are discussing today one that is relevant to all of our interests. And importantly, I observed this morning that the Shangri-La dialogue is one of the region's premier security fora, and importantly, in this context, its focus is not limited to the Asia-Pacific. Over time, the term Asia-Pacific had come to symbolise the main focus of Australia's strategic interests and economic priorities. But in more recent years, we have come to realise that we must consider our region in the context of the vast pace of globalisation, as well as the mutual dependencies that exist between it and the rest of the world. The region's continued economic growth is the basis for the rise in the global strategic weight of many Asia-Pacific countries. The bedrock of this growth is freedom of navigation and trade, along with the energy and trade corridors through both the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. These corridors link the Middle East through the North and Southeast Asia to the United States. Security of supply right across this corridor, which relies on continued regional stability, will therefore be vital. That's why we now refer to the Indo-Pacific region, by which I mean the maritime and littoral regions that span both the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. The shift of power to the Indo-Pacific is leading to increased growth, wealth and prosperity amongst regional states. By 2050, almost half of the world's economic output is expected to come from the Indo-Pacific, and this region will be home to 4 of the world's top 10 economies. Australia's top 5 trade partners are all in the Indo-Pacific, and approximately 98% of our international trade by volume travels by sea, and more than half of that through the South China Sea. Underlying tensions amongst regional states are likely to remain in the near-term strategic environment, but the shared dependence of most East Asian nations upon the Indo-Pacific region's maritime corridors, combined with the inability of any state to unilaterally secure its shipments, should be a powerful incentive to manage conflicting interests and ensure freedom of navigation and trade for all. Ladies and gentlemen, this shared interest in economic prosperity and trade routes is already enhancing some cooperation on security challenges that affect all of us, such as natural disasters, maritime piracy and terrorism. For example, the cooperation of various international military counter-piracy operations off the Horn of Africa has led to piracy dropping considerably in recent years. Australia's Adelaide-class frigate, the HMAS Newcastle, that is currently deployed in support of the US-led Combined Maritime Force, is the 60th Royal Australian Navy ship to deploy to the Middle East on such operations since the first Gulf War of 1990. But just as importantly, the type of day-to-day cooperation that helps build a degree of confidence and trust between Indo-Pacific navies, which would be too politically difficult and sensitive to conduct in territorial waters in East Asia, has become more possible in the Gulf of Aden. Even those navies which operate more autonomously, rather than as part of a multilateral command, still engage in practical cooperation with their regional counterparts. This cooperation offers the opportunity to increase communication and share information, conduct shipboard exchanges of commanding officers and staff, and engage in joint anti-piracy exercises. Anti-piracy in the Gulf of Aden represent a successful example of how regional countries can achieve sea lane security far across East Asia's shores, far away from East Asia's shores, even amidst degrees of strategic tensions at home. But history also teaches us that while greater independence reduces the likelihood of destabilising actions or conflicts between nations, it will not remove the risk altogether. And interdependence will not prevent states from engaging in coercive behaviour. In fact, it can provide the very economic links that facilitate coercive behaviour, and nor will it prevent miscalculation. While economic growth is leading to greater integration and interdependence, increased wealth also provides the means to modernise military forces. This has the potential to enable more capable security partnerships, but also to increase strategic competition. Over the next 20 years, the strategic environment is likely to become more challenging as states seek to promote their interests both regionally and globally. An ongoing global challenge will be the management of major powers competing more actively to promote their interests and seeking to have a greater say in how the global order functions. Australia believes that all regional partners represented here today have an enduring interest in maintaining safe and stable maritime trade and air passage. We therefore remain concerned by any developments in the South and East China Sea which raise tensions in the region. Australia has made clear its opposition to any coercive or unilateral actions to change the status quo in the South or East China Sea. This includes any large-scale land reclamation activity by claimants in the South China Sea, and we are particularly concerned at the prospect of militarisation of artificial structures. It is therefore important that countries agree as soon as possible on a substantive code of conduct for the South China Sea between the ASEAN members and China. Disputes must be resolved peacefully, and Australia urges all parties to exercise restraint, halt reclamation activities, refrain from provocative actions and take steps to ease tensions. Because when tensions are high, the risk of miscalculation resulting in conflict is very real. As with Newton's principles, aspects of international security are often characterised by an action and a corresponding counter-reaction. And while this doesn't always amount to a zero-sum equation, dealings between states in our region is an inherently competitive process. In making decisions, countries and leaders should always be wary of the consequences, unintended or otherwise, of a particular course of action, and the potential for these actions to lead to escalation and miscalculation. Australia has a legitimate interest in the maintenance of peace and stability in this part of the world, including the preservation of respect for international law, unimpeded trade and freedom of navigation. With ever-increasing regional and global interdependence, no country can act alone to solve the challenges that threaten the region's security. In fact, there is no better example of how security challenges in the wider world affect the Indo-Pacific than the threat posed by foreign fighters returning from conflicts in Iraq and in Syria. There are increasing numbers of Australians and others from this region who are connected with or inspired by overseas terrorist groups such as Daesh, with the intent and capability to conduct an attack against Australia and other countries in the region. Recent incidents in Kenya, Malaysia, France, Australia, in Canada and Belgium all provide a very real and sombre examples of the global nature of this threat to our national security and our societies. Accordingly, we must work together if we are going to defeat this threat. We firmly support ASEAN's call for the international community to cooperate in fighting extremism, radicalism and terrorism. It is safe to say that turbulence will be experienced over coming decades in the region from South Asia through the Middle East and East Africa, with an enduring need for international assistance within and between adjoining regions. That is why Australia works hard to strengthen links throughout the international system, based on common interests and the rule of law, including economic, diplomatic and defence cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, these challenges are not insurmountable. We should focus on our common interests and working in support of a stronger international system, underpinned by a global rules-based order as the best means of enhancing security cooperation in our wider region. Australia's strong network of regional and global defence relationships will be important. Enhancing these relationships will be a core theme of our forthcoming Defence White Paper, which will underline the importance of dialogue and cooperation to support shared responses to shared challenges. We welcome the region's expanding multilateral forums and their expanding areas of focus, cutting across traditional regions and building a foundation on ASEAN centrality. There is potential, for example, the East Asia Summit, the Asian Regional Forum and the Asian Defence Ministers Meeting Plus provide opportunities to discuss issues of concern for the broader Indo-Pacific region. And while multilateral forums have achieved much for practical military cooperation in the region, we cannot stand still. There is potential for the East Asia Summit as an organisation that brings heads of government together on political and economic issues to play a leading role in setting norms for security issues in this region in the future. To respond to global and regional security challenges, it is critical that all regional countries work together as partners. So I thank you for the opportunity of being a participant in this Shangri-La dialogue, and I look forward to the ongoing discussions about these important regional matters.
Thank you, Kevin Andrews, for addressing, just as did Federica Mogherini, exactly the theme of this session, global security challenge in the Asia-Pacific, building cooperation between regions. And I think, like her, you spent some time talking about the challenge of handling foreign fighters with Daesh, and therefore the need to have strong relations with Europe, with the Middle East, in order to combat this global phenomenon. So thank you very much for addressing so directly this theme. And could I now welcome to the stage the Minister of Defence of our host country, Dr. Ung Eng Hen. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, John. My fellow panelists, Ms. Mogherini, Australian Defence Minister Kevin Andrews, ladies and gentlemen. This year's Shangri-La Dialogue is held in a special year for Singapore, as many of you know, as we Singaporeans celebrate 50 years of independence. Thank you for being present and sharing this Golden Jubilee with us, and for your contributions that have made this year's Shangri-La Dialogue a success. Many of you have fed back that you found the Shangri-La Dialogue impactful, relevant. We're very happy when we hear that, because we do want to serve a function as hosts, but it is your presence and contributions that make the Shangri-La Dialogue the success that it is. Let me also thank the many ministers and guests for their condolences on Mr. Lee's passing and their admiration for his life's work and legacy. Impoverished and beset with a multitude of challenges at its founding, Singapore has been transformed over this half-century. Singapore's founding leaders and pioneer generation, with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew as the first Prime Minister, deserve much of the credit for putting us on a firm path to progress. But it would be remiss not to credit also the international milieu that was conducive for countries like Singapore in this region to develop and prosper together. Many of you come from countries, in the ensuing decades post-Second World War, as many of the ASEAN countries gained independence, including Singapore in 1960, to quote former Indonesian defense, America's forward connected. However, the international system as we know it is in flux for Asia today. China and India are no longer poor, at least not in aggregate terms, and certainly not marginalized by the Cold War or sequestered behind the bamboo curtain. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have set up a new development bank headquartered in Shanghai last year, with an initial capital pool of $50 billion and a currency reserve of US $100 billion. China is taking the lead in establishing the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, capitalized at US $100 billion and headquartered in Beijing. China has also launched its One Road, One Belt initiative and set up a US $40 billion Silk Road Fund. It proposes an era of expansion of infrastructure and connectivity with Asia, if not China, at its heart. According to one estimate, these initiatives could have an impact on more than 4 billion people in 65 countries. Japan has also offered, in collaboration with the ASEAN Development Bank, US $110 billion in funding for infrastructure in Asia over the next 5 years. The Trade Promotion Authority Bill, which will facilitate the finalization and conclusion of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is now making its way through the US Congress. Singapore certainly hopes that the TPP will form one of the driving forces that shape the economic future for this region. But with globalization, new transnational challenges have also emerged. Religious extremists and non-state actors like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, piracy, cybercrime, trafficking of humans, drugs, and weapons of mass destruction are also affecting this part of the world, home to the largest Muslim population globally. We are at a critical juncture as Asia plays an increasing important role in global trade, international finance, and military security. China is now the leading trading partner of all ASEAN states and Australasia. There is and will be pressure for the rules that have heretofore governed the international order to adjust to accommodate the nationalistic aspirations of new entrants and rising powers in the Asia-Pacific. The events in the East China Sea and South China Sea are manifestations of this change in the power dynamics. As examples, air defense identification zones and similar mechanisms for the seas and even potentially underwater for submarines have been instituted or proposed by states over international waters for purposes of self-defense, whilst ostensibly protecting freedom of navigation and overflight by others. Coupled with unresolved legal positions and different interpretations, whether related to sovereignty or application of rules in existing agreements such as UNCLOS to specific circumstances, these uncertainties and differences have resulted in increased tensions and even actual incidents at sea and in the air. None would disagree that a rules-based system must prevail if there is to be stability and peace in our region. It has served us well. But any rules framework, while necessary, is insufficient to engender stability and shared prosperity. To be responsive and relevant, alive to the challenges that confront us, rules need to be infused with the correct spirit. What is equally vital is the political commitment to build mutual confidence and trust within that framework based on shared interests and prosperity. Singapore, as a non-claimant state, takes no sides over the disputes in the South China Sea, but is concerned that uncertainties that exist in international agreements or disputes over claims have not built mutual confidence and trust, instead created instability. Indeed, a deficit of trust now exists and can grow. We must all work together to provide clarity, sooner rather than later, if not on principles or law, then on practices, procedures and practices that maintain regional stability and restore confidence and trust. In this light, the intention to work towards the early conclusion of the Code of Conduct on the South China Sea, which both China and ASEAN leaders reaffirmed their commitment during the 17th ASEAN-China Summit in November last year, is a positive example. that must be followed through to its completion expeditiously. Whether established powers or rising, large states or small, all of us have a vested interest to ensure that we maintain a rules-based system with respect for sovereignty and international law as the fundamental tenets for stability in this new century. It would be unrealistic to assume that the current rules and the existing institutions that promote them would remain status quo, even as new powers emerge. But even as the hierarchy of power dynamics alter across regions and between states, we have to ensure that the security architecture remains inclusive and operates on rules and norms that have the consensus of the international community at large. The alternative of such an inclusive architecture is a factional global system, where large powers contest for supremacy, each with its proxy players. Key players like the US, Europe, China, India, Japan in this region, ASEAN, and other plus countries have a critical role to play in this evolution where new rules and norms are proposed. As leaders, we need to guide this process attentively, exercise leadership and political will to engender trust. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, we must ensure that the rules-based framework that has brought peace and prosperity over the past several decades remains relevant and strong. This will require a new consensus that takes into account the realities of the 21st century, while ensuring that principles such as sovereignty, respect for international law, and peaceful settlement of disputes that protect the global commons remain at the core of the global order in this century. Let me finally conclude by wishing all of you, together with my co-host, President Tony Tan, Deputy Prime Minister Teo, and Minister Louis Tak-Yew, for your contributions to the Shangri-La dialogue, and wish you a safe journey home as the Congress ends. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you very much for those thoughtful remarks, and I retain in particular your call for Asia to work together to get agreement, if not on principles and law, then at least on practices and procedures. And I think that is a sound call that everybody here is bound to try to heed. This session has been on global security challenges and the Asia-Pacific, building cooperation between regions. So I invite people to make comments or ask questions on this vast and complex topic, but I remind people also that this is the concluding plenary of the Shangri-La dialogue. So if there are threads from this dialogue of the last 2 days that anyone would like to bring together, or topics that they feel haven't been precisely addressed, you're free to do so in this concluding plenary, and I look forward to a vigorous debate that will also help us in shaping the IISS research program on the Asia-Pacific and its links with other regions. We have a major set of activities planned on a variety of topics. We've launched a number of research products here, and so we hope that your expertise and practical knowledge will also infuse the work that we intend to do over the next year and further beyond. So I remind you of the practice to insert your chip card into the microphone and press the button, and I have a number of people who've sought the floor already, so we're bound to have a really excellent set of exchanges. There are about 15 or 20, and I'll call on as many as you as I can, giving perhaps preference to those who haven't had a chance yet to intervene. Could I call first on Dr. Bastian Giegerich, the IISS?
John, thank you very much. I have a question for High Representative Mogherini. Madam High Representative, as you are working on the review of the EU's foreign and security policy strategy, do you feel confident that a new strategy might underline the global dimension of the EU security provider role that you spoke about, or do you think a focus on Europe's more immediate vicinity might be necessary given current risks and threats in the East and South? So I would like to ask you to clarify the level of ambition, as it were, Is it a global or regional security provider? Is it a soft security or a more full spectrum security provider that you're looking for? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sanjaya Baru from India and the IISS.
Thank you, John. My question is to the Singapore Defense Minister. Prime Minister Lee mentioned a couple of days back that while Singapore hopes the United States would be made a member of the AIIB, that China would be invited into TPP. You mentioned, sir, your hope that TPP will be concluded. On the one hand, we hear in the presentations through the Shangri-La dialogue a desire for rule of law, for strengthening multilateral systems, for inclusive frameworks. And yet, on the other hand, we know that initiatives like the TPP are essentially disrupting the global trading system because the WTO is not able to progress anywhere. And the AIIB has been launched partly because of the inability of the international community to restructure the IMF and the World Bank. So it's the failure of multilateralism that has actually encouraged regionalism. So is there not some inconsistency that we hope multilateral institutions will be strengthened in the field of security, but on the other hand, in the field of economics, we find regionalism gaining ground?
Thank you. And from Norway, former Foreign and Defence Minister, and now with the World Economic Forum, Espen Barth Eide.
Thank you, John. Today and throughout the conference, there's been a lot of reference to what Minister Ng just said as well, that it's a question of how we manage the power shift and at the same time maintain an overarching rules-based order. I think that's exactly the point, and I just want to point out that the question, which here is seen very much as a regional issue, is really one of the most important global issues, because if you get it right in this region, it will have very positive global ramification. If you get it wrong, it will be to the detriment of everyone, because this involves some of the largest economies and largest powers in the world. And my question is, what is the practical steps beyond just talking about the code of conduct, which I strongly support? In the roadmap to 2015 from ASEAN, I believe that there was some ideas about updating or revising the TAC, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia. Is there anything there that you can share with us, which is, the actual tools that you will do to provide this rule-based order while at the same time accepting the power shift that's going on in the region? Thank you.
Thank you. And from Japan, Shingo Yamagami.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. I have a question to ask Ms. Mogherini as to rule of law at South China Sea, because that was most frequently used word at this dialogue. And when we talk about rule of law, certainly, we have to emphasize the importance of international judicial dispute settlement mechanism, such as ICJ, such as the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea. So, based upon European experience, is there any advice you can give to us in this region as to how to make use of this international dispute settlement mechanism at South China Sea? Thank you.
Thank you. And from the UK, and a well-known expert on the DPRK, Aidan Foster-Carter.
Thank you very much, John, and no prizes for guessing what I'm going to say. Not really addressed to the panel, but your kind invitation to raise wider issues. North Korea is absent. Well, that's no surprise in terms of them being here in the hall. You ask them every year, and every year they don't come. But also absent from the agenda, name-checked from time to time. I totally understand this. North Korea fatigue is setting in all round, probably for all of us. but it gets no less worrying or less dangerous under Kim Jong-un, or because it happens to have been quiet for a while. No reproach is intended, sir, of course, but anybody got any good ideas out there? Just to make sure that the DPRK does not go unrepresented here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aidan. I do notice that you're sitting beside the Director for Non-Proliferation of IISS, Mark Fitzpatrick, who publishes quite a bit on North Korea, so hasn't been absent from our work, but I do know that we haven't had much opportunity to debate it, at least in plenary session here, so thank you for bringing that up. From France, Camille Grand.
Thank you. My question is for the High Representative on EU's role, because you strongly emphasized the sort of European role and ambition in Asia. And I was wondering if you intend to reflect this in the future external policy review and strategy that you're currently working on, bearing in mind that the 2003 European security strategy was pretty weak on Asia. I think it devoted a paragraph in a 13-page document. And also keeping in mind that many Europeans advocate a focus on the European neighborhood and not the sort of a global view. And my question to both ministers would be, what do you expect from the EU and the Europeans in Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific? Thank you very much.
I'm going to take one more question, then I'm going to come back to the panel for a couple of minutes each, but then we will have a second round and we'll have 8 or 9 more interventions. But last in this first round from China, Wang Yiwei.
Thank you, Chairman. As a professor, Director of the Center for EU Studies at the Renmin University of China, I'm very pleased to see Madame Mogherini again. I have 2 questions for you to want to share with your European experience. Number one is inclusiveness is the base of the peace. So in Europe, you have NATO and the NATO-Russian Council. In China, in Asia, there's a U.S. bilateral airline system, not include China. And then we are negotiating with COC or DOC, which not include United States. So this asymmetric security arrangement, how can guarantee the long-term stable and peace in Asia-Pacific? Second lessons we can learn from European Union, that's the war. You know, last year we celebrated 100 years of the breakout of the First War. This year, 70 years. The EU is a result of the 2 great wars. So when the think about the First World War, which triggered by the small incident by small countries, and then all the great powers involved, and then punished the Germany too much, and then have the Second World War. So think about the South China Sea or the Asia Pacific. Now, how can you guarantee the United States and China not hijack or not, repeat the same tragedy that the small countries or other countries could get them involved, and then they cannot avoid the direct confrontation, particularly in the South China Sea? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll return to the panel now, a couple of minutes each or so, in the order in which they appeared, so as not to lose the trail of all of these points. Federica Mogherini, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess I have 3 questions. 2 are very similar ones. The next EU strategy. First of all, let me say I'm very happy to see that it's known that we're working on a security strategy. I think this is already a goal that we achieved. We are in the process of starting this. In the June European Council, heads of state and government will be presented with a report that I will do on the assessment of the global challenges that we are facing at the moment, which are many and serious, and that after 2003 are definitely different and changed. Not only the world and the challenges have changed, also the European Union has changed very much. So this will be the starting point, and then we will have, I would say, almost 1 year for developing the strategy itself with a full sense of ownership of all the 28 member states, not only at a governmental level, but also with a broader foreign policy and security community across Europe. The level of ambition of the strategy that I would suggest, but again, we are at the very beginning of the process, is a high one. Not only because I believe Europe has the means to play a major role, but also because I believe Europe has the responsibility to play a major role. I take here 2 sub-questions. One is it going to be a soft power approach or a full spectrum approach. I would rather go for the second. I think I made it quite clear that I see the military capacities of the European Union as such as something to explore more. And I believe that hard power and soft power are complementary. And indeed, I mean, the soft power of Europe is very well perceived everywhere, but the other one is less so. And we are working together with NATO in full complementarity to strengthen what we can do also in the hard power sphere, because we need it and we can do it. And because, as someone mentioned, we have an issue of increasing the level of output of our defense capabilities. And in Europe, we have an issue of spending on defense that we need to tackle in a European way if we want investments to be productive and sustainable. The second question I got on this is, are we going to focus on the neighborhood, or are we going to look at the bigger scale, at the global role? I think we do not have any contradiction in this respect. Europe will be a global, credible global player and a useful global player if it starts playing a major role in our neighborhood, in our region. Because if you look at the world today, some of the key elements of instability are all around the European Union borders, in some cases also within the European territory. South and east of the European Union. So we have to take responsibility about that. That is my starting point. And I believe that taking more responsibility in the area, especially across the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, but also in thinking or rethinking our relationship with Russia, which is another element we didn't really touch upon, but it is very high on the agenda of the European Union this last year or so, is something that is going to make it possible for Europe also to focus on the rest of the world. I don't see them in contradiction. I believe that we can play a regional role at full and a global one at the same time. Second question about South China Sea, the rule of law, the importance of judicial mechanism and the advice based on European Union experience. First of all, let me say that I come here, I don't know if that is usual, but I come here with the idea that we don't have lessons to teach. The European experience is solid, is long, is important, is painful. We have been the center of major wars, conflicts and crises. We have been the center of tragedies over the last century and in the centuries before that. Europe we tend to picture it as a success story. It is in the last 65 years, for sure, but we bring a lot of responsibility for the world sufferance in the past. So we do have lessons that we take from our own failures in the past centuries. But this is an experience. This is not a lesson to be learned. This is something we can share, thinking and reflecting on this together with our partners that have their own experiences that are as valuable as ours. So I don't have any lessons to teach. But what I can say from a European perspective is that yes, our way, our own way of living together and overcoming conflicts and disputes, knowing that it's far from perfect also in these days, is to look for peaceful cooperative solutions, is to look also at internationally recognized legal dispute settlement mechanisms and to use them. As the Minister said, not only setting the rules, but also making the rules relevant is the European way. And this is also very much the case for inclusiveness. This is the way in which we build peace in Europe, and this is what we can bring to the rest of the world experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kevin Andrew.
I'll respond to the question about what our expectations in this region might be towards the Europeans. Can I begin by observing the very strong historical and people-to-people links, particularly with Europe and Australia, that has been built upon over decades and centuries now by a very significant economic and trading partnership, one which will continue into the future. I suppose my simple response to go beyond that is to urge the nations of Europe to take an interest in the events which occur in this region, particularly in the security context, just as, for example, Australia has taken an interest in the events that have occurred recently between Russia and Ukraine, especially following the shooting down of the MH17 aircraft. Our response to that was a strong response, again urging the parties not to act coercively or aggressively, to respect the rule of law and to follow practices of negotiation and discussion. And equally, I would urge the European nations to take an interest in events in this region as we've taken an interest in events in their region.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ong.
Thank you for your questions, which were very good ones and drive at the heart of the challenge before us. Asia and Asia-Pacific region is at the point with the greatest potential for self-determination. Not in recent history, you have to go back many, many centuries, if not millennia, to find an equivalent time in history. And it is at juncture of the greatest potential to shape our own futures in a global community, and as many of you said, not only for the rules of the road for this region, but because the center of gravity will shift to Asia-Pacific region, indeed for the whole world. Whether it's for maritime security, whether it's for trade, whether it's for global finance, Asia will play a bigger role. And it is this context in which we describe the driving engines for the next few decades ahead, whether it's AIIB, whether it's the BRICS, whether it's Japan's funding through the ADB, and in that context, the TPP. Are these new engines of growth disruptive and a reflection of failed multilateralism of existing institutions and therefore new ones? Partly yes, partly no, but that is exactly the situation that is occurring. As new rising powers, as new engines of growth emerge, there will be that iterative process, that dialectical process, if you like, where existing institutions do not respond enough adequately, or whether it's to the influence or the power or the impact, where new engines are proposed. And I believe that these new engines will shape the shape of Asia, how Asia behaves, and indeed beyond. For defense, we have, over the last decade or so, tried to evolve new platforms. The ADMM Plus is one such platform. It started with the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, 10 countries. And for purposes of efficiency and effectiveness, we decided to expand it to include +8 countries. I think it will continue to evolve as capacities grow. The ARF is a larger creature, but there are trade-offs. But both represent attempts, and the EAS, all three represent attempts to create platforms that are more relevant, that user states will find more intimately connected with their day-to-day issues. The question was asked, what is the practical way ahead? And although this is a security conference, my perspective on the South China Sea is that indeed we need to approach it with some equanimity. The South China Sea resolution is not the destination. It is a journey. There are outcrops that may scuttle us, but surely in the larger scheme of things, there are more important things that we also need to focus on. This is not to downplay the efforts we need to do in terms of resolving the South China Sea disputes, and I think the implementation guidelines and the declaration of conduct has been a very substantive document. If you've not read it, I commend it to you. It is not just a statement of motherhood statements. There are discrete prescriptions which conscribe behavior, which infuse it with the right spirit. And I think if all signatories adhere to both the spirit and the letter of the Declaration of Conduct, I think tensions can be diffused. What part does EU play in this evolving landscape? I think a critical one. Because EU has that historical perspective, and I found it very, very useful, for instance, for the German defense minister to share her perspective of what it meant for strength by alliances rather than strength by alone, because Germany is an economic power and not a large military power. So I would say that EU has a critical role to play in this evolution of new rules making and of new rule makers. Finally, on North Korea, we discussed North Korea below the radar for particular reasons, and we do share as ministers meet. So I would tell you that it is on our minds, but sometimes not in public eye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go now back, and I'll take about 8 or 10, so if you can be as crisp and precise as possible. I'll start with Virginia Commerly from the IISS.
Thank you, John. My question goes to High Representative Mogherini. You spoke of shared challenges, and I would like to bring up the issue of illegal migration, which is a problem very visible both in this region, as we know, and in Europe, and you've been very vocal within the EU with regard to the need of tackling this problem. So I was wondering whether you could share some suggestions based on your experience with your local counterparts here on how to best deal with the problem. I know you don't want to impart lessons, but I'm always of the idea that sharing best practices is very useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And from the UK and the IISS, and the Executive Director of the IISS Middle East Office in Bahrain, Sir John Jenkins.
Thank you very much, John. My question, naturally, I think for someone who lives and works in the Middle East, is about counter-terrorism and counter-extremism. All of the panel have touched upon this issue in various ways. And of course, the latest manifestation is the Islamic State, Daesh. I'm old enough to have worked in Malaysia at the time of the security scare over Darul Arqam and Muhammad Ashari 25 years ago. Of course, we saw Jamaat Islamiyah in Indonesia. These, in some ways, were local phenomena, but now this is truly global. And the genealogies go back a long, long way and are very complex. But when we are seeing Australians, Malay speakers, Indonesian speakers, allegedly radicalization among Rohingya in Burma, these people going to fight in a distant country for a global cause. This is a truly global problem that affects us all. And if you look at what the Islamic State is claiming in the Middle East, it claims two things. One is political power, and the other is ideological and religious authority. The political issue, in a sense, you can deal with militarily and through intelligence means. The ideational and religious issues are much more difficult to deal with. So some of this is military, some of this is intelligence, some of this is something else. And I'm interested in two questions. One is, do you think, and we talk about cooperation, but do you think we're really talking to each other enough about this? Not just Europe and Southeast Asia, but within Southeast Asia itself and between Southeast Asia and the countries of the Middle East. And the second question is, and this is perhaps particularly to Dr. Ng, what lessons do you think we can learn from the experience of Southeast Asia? Thank you.
Thank you. And from Australia, Professor Christopher Roberts.
Thank you. Until last week's statements and actions by the United States, the situation in the South China Sea, East China Sea and the Ukraine had alarmed me as being reminiscent of the League of Nations and the politics of appeasement during the interwar years, something that we all know was somewhat of a disastrous failure. We must also remember that there was strong economic interdependence between the key provocateurs prior to World War I. So even this has its limitations in mitigating conflict. While we should always hope for the best, we must be also prepared for the worst. Assuming for a moment it is not possible for ASEAN to muster the level of cohesion for a necessary code of conduct, which would also require China's consent, what more can be done by the West and Asia to unequivocally demonstrate any belief in Beijing or demonstrate or show that it has achieved a fait accompli in the South China Sea is wrong? Should other claimants also seek recourse to UNCLOS and the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague? Could such actions include also a mix or even coalition of middle and great powers to deter China from its current path? Expediency will naturally be necessary because at the current pace of development, it is feasible that China will have consolidated its interests in the South China Sea within the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you. And from the US Rear Admiral retired, and a friend of ours, Robert James.
Well, 2 years ago at this meeting, a U.S. representative said that the United States would pivot toward Asia. So my question is, how does the panel expect us, the United States, to do, and what would you like to have us do? And remember that in the last 2 years we've done nothing, so that's an interesting thing also. I'd appreciate if you make your answer as clear as you can, because as a U.S. citizen and a businessman, I'm not at all sure what the United States means by pivoting toward Pacific. Do we intend to be a world policeman like we've done so well in the Middle East? Or what would you like to see us do?
Thank you very much. Teresa Fallon. Your microphone's on. Unless you pressed the button and turned it off. Well, I'll come back to you in a moment. Tim Huxley.
Thanks, John. My question is for High Representative Mogherini. High Representative, you made the point very strongly that Europe and Asia can do so much more together, including in the security field. I wonder if you could address the question of institutional asymmetry. The EU has multiple interlocutors in Asia. It has no direct equivalent in Asia. ASEAN can hardly represent all the parties that the EU needs to relate to in Asia, which of course include China, India, Japan and Korea. So my question is, to what extent does this complicate prospects for a more profound European role in Asian security, and how might that challenge be overcome? And also there's a related question of how does the EU and will the EU in the future in its policy in Asia accommodate the fact that at least some European member states have their own autonomous or semi-autonomous policies with regard to Asian partners, not least in the area of security? Thank you very much.
Dr. Wen Guangxiao.
Thank you, John. My questions would like to address the questions to Karen Andrews of Australia and Dr. N of Singapore. Thank you for your wonderful contributions. We had an interesting special session yesterday on avoiding military competition and preventing arms race in the region. On the other hand, we heard repeatedly references to defense spending increase in this region, and also remarks about plans to introduce new weapons platforms, and enhancing power projection capabilities in the region. So it seems to me there is a huge gap between what is being called for regarding a rules-based new defense or security architecture and what is actually going on the ground. How would you like to propose that the nations in the region and other countries interested in the Southeast Asia security architecture to address this new issue, the gap between what is actually going on in terms of the arms race and in terms of all the norms and the principles that are being called for. For instance, any suggestions as to a institutional arrangement for arms or for disarmament negotiations to take place among the nations, in addition to other measures to build trust and confidence and to avoid miscalculations that may lead to increased tension and open conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. Teresa Fallon.
Okay, thank you. This is to follow up with Professor Huxley's question. Federica Mogherini, you said, count on us, we are here. What does that mean? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just, I got him right, Peter Jennings from Australia.
Thank you, John. My question follows from Sir John Jenkins, and that is to say all three speakers and many others have referred to the growth of extremist terrorism as a risk in each home country. Would the speakers agree that we're unlikely to be free from the terror threat unless we find a decisive way to take ISIL off the geographic map and off the psychological map? And if so, what additional steps would the speakers recommend to be taken in terms of military action that will ensure a successful outcome in Iraq and Syria?
Tough questions. Alex Neil.
Thank you, John. One of the common threads that we've heard throughout the summit this weekend has been the One Belt, One Road initiative, and Minister Ng also mentioned this in his speech. Some have argued that it's a sort of new Marshall Plan or a counter pivot, if you like. And I'm wondering if the panelists could offer their perceptions of what the tangible elements to this new Eurasian venture by China are. Thank you.
Mark Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. Taking up your offer to let us raise issues not so far raised in the session, I note that the most recent international conference before this one was a conference in New York reviewing the NPT. That conference didn't go as well as I think this one is going, although luckily we don't have to, we're not expected to come up with an outcome document. Issues concerning disarmament steps being too slow, a humanitarian initiative, and Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction were the issues over which that conference floundered. I wonder if in this region, the Bangkok Treaty remains a foundation for a nuclear weapons-free zone. But more closer, China's recent MIRVing of long-range ballistic missiles has introduced some concerns. I wonder if panelists might have any comments about nuclear policy.
From France, Dr. Sophie Boisseau-Durocher.
Yes, my question will go to Federica Mogherini. Thank you for your presentation on the prospect for a stronger EU-ASEAN security partnership and the basic idea, to strengthen very concrete, functional cooperation. Yet, during this dialogue, some comments have been made on strengthening the EAS, for instance. The European Union is not part of the EAS, neither it is of the ADMM++. So I would like to know what is your expectation for a potential EU participation in this security dialogue?
And from the United States, Dean Cheng.
This is a year of many anniversaries, including the 40th anniversary
of the Helsinki Accords, which had established the norm that borders are set and are not to be unilaterally altered. One of the things that we have seen in Europe, it seems, is the exploitation of political warfare and quote-unquote little green men to alter those borders. And I would be curious to hear from all of the panelists what lessons or what steps might be taken to prevent unilateral changes in borders in this region where there isn't even the equivalent of the Helsinki Accords to establish the norm of the inviolability of borders to begin with.
And from India, Commodore Sujit Samadar.
Thank you, IISS, for this opportunity to be here for 2 days of very intellectually stimulating, and a host of issues have been covered. My question is on relates to other security challenges, particularly with regard to extremism, radicalism, and terrorism that the world is now faced with, particularly in the context of the IISS utilizing the social media as a garnering opportunity for funds and new recruits. So my question is, what kind of a common approach could this panel suggest to ensure that the freedom of the global commons is not held hostage to disruptive elements and yet profitably utilized by the rest of society for the common prosperity of the world, and a sort of special anti-access and media denial, A2MD approach for such red-flagged organizations for the common security that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's about 10 others on the list. I'm just going to take 2 more and then come back to the panel, and I apologize to those who I will have left out. Michito Tsuruka from Japan.
Thank you very much. I have a question to High Representative Mogherini. You made a very honest plea that don't look at the EU only as a big FTA. I very much agree to that, and there are various military, political, security aspects that the EU has now. But looking at the broader picture of the EU as an international actor or global actor, what I think is important is that still the huge power comes from economic presence of the EU. So putting aside CSDP and other direct political and security things, what I'm wondering is that I would like you to explore a bit more about what and how EU can use such economic power for political ends or strategic ends. Thank you.
Dr. Liu Fu-Kuo.
Well, thank you so much. I would have such a wonderful opportunity to wrap up. Actually, I have 2 quick points. The first one, during the last 2 days of discussion on the South China Sea, a lot of things happened, but I consider too much focus on land reclamation. As a Minister just mentioned earlier, November 2002, DOC has been a very important document. But since then on, the most important development is 2009, the Philippines has its own baseline law. And 2012, Vietnam passed the Law of Sea. And then China responded with Sansa City establishment. So since then on, we realized that if you are talking about resolution, you have to go beyond domestic law. And I think looking around, I think we haven't really come to that point, how exactly we may be able to find a resolution. If you keep pushing UNCLOS, it is just offering some part of the possibility. But I think the rest of them would have to be discussed through the negotiation and also COC. Minister mentioned quite rightly, this is a journey, not a resolution. I very much agree with that. So the final point, not to our panelists, it is for John, because this year we have heard Secretary Ashton Carter already proposed initiative, and then Japanese ministers also offer another Shangri-La dialogue initiative. So here I would suggest that perhaps after all these 14 years, to wrap up, perhaps IISS can think of forming a joint task force study group focusing on the South China Sea. exactly you can reflect transnational perspective, not simply from individual national interests, which normally come up with criticizing each other's. So I would once again thanks for this great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I will soon return to the panel. My direct answer to your question is that the IISS is principally an international research organization. We publish independent, fact-based research of all kinds on matters of international security. We work really hard in Asia-Pacific security, and I think if you look at the Regional Security Assessment 2015, a 250-page dense, fact-rich document that we produced in preparation for this 2015, I think you will see that we will have laid out our independent and international analysis on all of the sensitive and difficult issues that are being addressed here. But the Adelphi book series that Nick Redman represents, edits, is publishing enormously on the Asia-Pacific. We have published on maritime security and the South Asian disputes in the very recent past. So thank you very much for giving me such a public opportunity for product placement, and I recommend that any of you who are not now members of the IISS and not subscribers to our publications fill out the forms that we will very happily provide for you. And before asking each of the panelists to answer in a bundled way the questions that have been asked, I'll give you each a couple of minutes to tease out the most important point. Don't feel that you have to go one by one. Each of you have a capacity of extemporaneous thought and speech. So bring out what you think are the right conclusions. I might say to Federica Mogherini, in line with the proposal that has just been made, that of course the IISS based in the UK puts itself at your disposal for any brainstorming workshops or analysis that you think our international staff can deliver to the production of your European strategy and foreign policy documents. So Federica Mogherini first, then Kevin Andrews and Dr. Ung, your concluding statements inspired by the questions from the floor just now.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you for the availability. We're going to use it for sure, and thank you also for basically allowing us not to answer the questions. But I'll take a couple of specific ones that I think I cannot skip. One on migration, because indeed this is top of the list in Europe, also here in the region. Completely different situations, completely different approaches. We do not have best practices to sell, but we are developing responsible responses to something that is at the moment a humanitarian crisis, first of all. So our first approach is saving lives, sharing responsibilities within the European Union. Second, tackling the root causes, poverty and wars, partnering with especially countries of origin and transit, and countries of transit sometimes become also themselves countries of destination. Working very much with international partners, especially our Mediterranean Arab friends, the African Union, the UNHCR, the IOM, the UN system. Seeing also the connection between the traffickers and smugglers organizations and some other criminal activities, possibly even terrorist activities, so the security nexus that might be there, especially when it comes to financing criminal activities. So this is also a matter of national and European security. And again, stressing the need to develop internal European policies of solidarity, internal EU solidarities, because otherwise, if we do not share, I don't say the burden, I say the responsibility of welcoming the people, this is not going to be sustainable in the long term for our own internal public opinions, and that can have a political impact on the European Union political life. Second question, general terms, I would take is the question about the EU not having equivalent institutions in Asia, and if this institutional asymmetry makes relations more complicated. I have a question to ask back. Do you see any other institution in the world that can have a parallel with the European Union? I believe not. This doesn't make it impossible for us to work with other institutions, being them regional ones. Still, all regional institutions are different from the European Union. or with single countries with whom we have strong partnerships. The same goes for the European Union member states. Not only some European Union member states have their own policy towards Asia, but I would say all European Union member states have their own policies towards the rest of the world. This does not make it impossible at all for the European Union to develop its own policy based on our common European interest. This is a revolutionary approach in terms of communication, but this is really true. The European member states' national interest when it comes to foreign and security policy, in reality, not in narrative, but in reality, in real terms, coincides so much with what we can do as Europeans all together. We need each other. There's not one single threat, one single opportunity that one single European country, and I'm going to finish, can take by its own. Even the bigger one, even the bigger ones. We have many. We only can do it together. And so my point is that we do not have any contradictions between having strong member states' policies and having a strong European Union policy. We can complement each other, and in reality, that is what is happening on Ukraine, in Asia, on terrorism, on the Middle East, in Latin America, towards Africa, on climate change, on many things. We are much stronger if we put our things together, and this is not contradicting, but serving the national interests. One last thing, very much in line with this, what does count on us mean? It means simply that the European Union, which means Europe, not just the European Union institutions, Europe as a family, is interested and willing in increasing our partnership with Asia as a whole. Not only
the source of the problem is ultimately addressed, then the problem remains. But secondly, for a nation like Australia, we took a very strong resolve that this illegal smuggling of people was not only undesirable, but indeed had real dangers, with many drownings of people involved in that, and we needed to stop it. So we were resolved to take the measures necessary to stop the trade, but ultimately it goes back to the question of why is it occurring in the first place and how the international community can respond to that. Secondly, there were some questions and comments around Daesh and ISIS, one of which was, are we cooperating enough given the spread of the tentacles of this terrorism throughout the world? There is considerable intelligence sharing. For example, one of the plots that was just uncovered in Australia involved sharing of intelligence from the UK with Australia, but the reality is we have to do much more. Propaganda has always been used by those who want to advocate certain outcomes, but the challenge today is that we've got that propaganda being delivered directly into the living rooms and bedrooms of young people around the world in a very powerful way, and the pattern that we are seeing in Australia is that one of self-radicalisation occurring particularly amongst young people, and I think that's a problem that we have throughout the world. So that remains a challenge, and obviously we need to share as much intelligence as we can. Peter Jennings asked about the terror threat and a decisive way to remove it. I suppose in terms of military action, Peter, that there are usually two sort of reasons for it. One is to win a decisive victory, or the other is to obtain sufficient advantage to force a negotiation or settlement between the warring or conflicting parties. The difficulty in relation to Daesh and ISIL is that I don't believe they're interested in a negotiated settlement. The proclamation of a caliphate in itself is a rejection of the nation state as a means or a process of international order, and therefore the prospect of a negotiated, mediated or otherwise discussed outcome, I suspect, is not really a realistic possibility, and therefore that leaves us with no option but to defeat this threat to the rest of the world. And I know that in that regard there's a further meeting of foreign ministers in Paris this coming week of the coalition nations to look at how we can do that. In the case of Iraq, we're not involved in Syria. Australia is not involved in Syria. We are in Iraq. We recognise two things. One is ultimately there has to be a political settlement, otherwise there will not be a settlement. And secondly, it must ultimately involve the efforts of the Iraqi ground forces to overcome ISIL or Daesh in that country. Finally, can I just say something about the issues that related to the region and the South China Sea, including can more be done? Well, Secretary Carter issued his call yesterday. We would say from Australia's perspective that we take no claim on the merits of the individual nation claims to various outcrops and reefs in the South China Sea, but we believe it is important that those be resolved in a peaceful way. We believe that right of passage for both on the sea and in the air must be maintained, and that finally that it's in the interests of all parties concerned to maintain a peaceful resolution to this, because whether you're talking about any of the countries in the region or others further away, such as Australia, then it's in our interests, all of us, to ensure that we have a peaceful and free trading region so far as that's concerned. The question from Mr. Shan about is the pursuit of a rules-based order at odds with the build-up of military defences in all countries or many countries. That build-up of military capability tends to follow economic growth historically, and therefore there's not necessarily a conflict. I suppose from my perspective, I would add that peace is often best secured from a position of strength, and therefore the build-up, the modernisation, the maintenance of a military capacity is not at odds with a peaceful resolution to these issues.
Thank you very much. I might just note that Federica Mogherini has a plane to catch, and she wishes all of you safe travel back as well to your own countries. Dr. Ung.
There are a number of questions, but let me take them in two large groups on counterterrorism. I think one of the most impactful results of the Shangri-La dialogue this year has been the widespread recognition that religious-based terrorism is a global phenomenon. Whether it was at ministerial lunches, from Prime Minister Lee's speech, or our discussions, it is sobering that this is affecting us all. And rather than respond to the question in just theoretical terms, we'll share some of the experience that we personally had since 9/11, where the world woke up to the problem. And I would say that looking back, and generally we had local cells that were Al-Qaeda inspired and related. They were also plotting attacks against Singapore, and this predated 9/11. There was a point, is there enough information sharing? I agree completely, there always can be more, and it was really both our internal intelligence as well as information shared from friends and partners to us about threats to Singapore that allowed us to unearth a local cell, Jamia Islamiyah, that disrupted these attacks. We recognized early that this was a multifaceted problem, and that you need a community on your side, especially the religious-based groups, and that is why we started inter-religious councils, and we meet with them often. Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister Teo and myself and others have met them just recently, and our pitch to them was, if and when an attack occurs, we need you the day after to hold the community together. We need you to say what you feel, not to allow trust to be broken, discord to be sown, and that is the most devastating impact that any such incident would occur. I think what we have accomplished, I'm sure that the Home Affairs Ministry would be happy to share with you and is on record, but what we did for Al-Qaeda related cells, we are also doing for ISIS. Prime Minister Lee asked the question, how long this particular challenge will last. And he alluded to an atheist-based ideology, communism, that took 70 years to be vanquished. It's anyone's guess how long this religious-based fanaticism, extremism, jihadi terrorism will last, but I think it'll be us for many decades. The other set of questions relate to US-China. What do we want US to do? We would say, keep doing what you're doing. And I think it's unfair to say that US hasn't been doing much in the last couple of decades. The US presence is predominant. It is a resident power. For China, we've got to understand that China needs the world as much as the world needs China. If the Chinese economic engine stalls, we will all hurt. And this is an evolving process. I think Deputy CGS Sun Jianguo's parting comment in Chinese was a very useful one. 信不信，看行动. Whether you believe or do not believe what we say, watch what we do. And we hold China to that statement.
Minister Ung, Kevin Andrews, Federica Mogherini, thank you very much for these splendid presentations. Could I ask the hall to thank the ministers for their remarks? I will make some... I judge this 14th Shangri-La Dialogue to have been an immense success. A few statistics just to interest you. We had 493 delegates. We issued slightly over 5,000 badges. 38 countries and international organizations were represented here this weekend, and there were 67 bilaterals within this hotel, but over 100 if you include those that were managed outside it. And as Minister Ung stated, there were a number of trilateral and multilateral meetings as well. And we were delighted as the co-host that many of the ministers used the platform of the Shangri-La Dialogue to test ideas or to proposals. And we know that in a number of the bilateral meetings there was real substantial. Last session was on global security challenges in the Asia-Pacific, building cooperation between regions, and I think that was actually a theme throughout the conference, from the splendid address we received on Friday evening from Prime Minister Lee through to today's discussions. And that's why we very much hope that many of the ministers represented here at the Shangri-La Dialogue will consider warmly the invitations that they will have received or will soon receive from the IISS to participate in the Manama Dialogue in Bahrain, which this year will be held from the 30th of October to the 1st of November. Been latterly the case in order to ensure that everybody's schedules can allow